4 people live in this house. She feeds the cat every morning. He plays with her for an hour after work. The kids beg for her attention all day, and every single night, she walks past all 3 of them and sleeps on him, the one who does the least. Cats don't need loyalty to survive. They don't obey commands. They don't perform affection for anyone, and yet they choose. For decades, scientists assumed this was impossible, that cats were too wild at heart for real attachment. The data says something else entirely, something that isn't really about cats at all. For most of modern science, the cat was treated as a mystery. Nobody bothered to solve seriously. Dogs got the attention. Dogs got the decades of research into loyalty, bonding, obedience, into every wag and whine that scientists could measure and graph. Cats got a shrug and a single assumption passed down for generations. Cats tolerate us. They stay for the food, the warmth, the shelter. Nothing more than a convenient arrangement dressed up to look like affection. It made sense on the surface. A cat doesn't come running when called. A cat doesn't perform joy the way a dog does. Doesn't press its whole body against your leg the second you walk through the door. A cat can survive without you entirely. It can hunt. It can wander for days. It can vanish into a neighborhood and come back like nothing happened, completely indifferent to how long it left you wondering. So the logic followed, almost naturally. If a creature doesn't need you to survive, it probably doesn't love you either. Need and love got quietly fused into the same idea, and cats failed the test before anyone even ran it. But somewhere around 2 decades ago, a small group of researchers started asking a very different question. Not whether cats were capable of forming emotional bonds, but whether they had ever actually been tested for it correctly in the first place. Because here is the strange part of this story. When scientists finally sat down and ran the exact same attachment experiments on cats that had been run on dogs and on human infants for more than 50 years, the cats didn't fail the test. They passed it, almost identically to the other 2. That single discovery didn't just quietly update a textbook somewhere. It forced open a much bigger question, one that had been sitting untouched for decades. If cats are capable of forming real attachment, then why does that attachment feel so selective? Why does a cat living with 4 different people in the same house consistently choose to bond deeply with exactly one of them? Part of the reason it took science so long to even ask that question comes down to something surprisingly simple: funding and convenience. Dogs are easy to study in large numbers. They can be trained to perform specific behaviors on command inside a laboratory, brought into unfamiliar rooms without the entire experiment collapsing, tested over and over with consistent results. Cats, famously, do none of that on request. Early researchers who tried running standard behavioral tests on cats often ended up with an animal that simply refused to participate, hid under furniture, or ignored the apparatus entirely. For decades, that refusal to cooperate was quietly misread as evidence of the very indifference researchers had already assumed going in. Nobody stopped to consider that the test itself might be measuring the wrong thing, on the wrong terms, for a species that had never been bred to comply. It took a new generation of researchers, willing to redesign the experiments around feline behavior instead of forcing cats into a framework built for dogs, to finally get a fair result. The answer, as it turns out, doesn't begin in that living room at all. It begins roughly 10,000 years earlier, in a place none of those 4 people would ever recognize. Every domestic animal alive today carries an origin story written into its behavior. Dogs were shaped by us, deliberately, generation after generation, bred for obedience, for herding, for guarding livestock, for simple companionship. Humans chose the traits they wanted and selected for them relentlessly. In a very real sense, humans built the loyalty into the species itself. Cats never went through anything close to that process. Not really, and not for most of their history with us. About 10,000 years ago, in the earliest farming settlements of the Fertile Crescent, humans began storing surplus grain for the very first time in recorded history. It was a revolutionary shift in how people lived. But grain, stored in large quantities, attracted rodents in equally large numbers. And rodents, inevitably, attracted the wildcats living on the edges of those settlements. Nobody invited them in. Nobody selected them for temperament, or bred the calmer ones together the way early dog breeders would later do. The cats simply noticed an opportunity that hadn't existed before, a place with a steady, reliable food source and considerably less competition than the surrounding wild. So they stayed, entirely on their own terms, coming and going as they pleased. This is what evolutionary biologists now call self-domestication. Unlike dogs, cats were never selected by human hands for closeness or obedience. They selected themselves, generation after generation. The friendlier, calmer individuals tolerated human proximity more easily, ate more consistently, bred more successfully near settlements, and slowly, over thousands of years, the species' genetics shifted just enough to make them comfortable existing near us. Not obedient to us, simply comfortable. That distinction sounds small. It is not. Because it means the bond a modern cat forms was never bred into its behavior as a survival requirement, the way it was for dogs. A dog that historically failed to bond with humans struggled, often severely, to be fed, protected, or kept around at all. A cat that fails to bond with a specific human can simply leave. It can hunt for itself. It can find another territory, another food source, another life entirely, with far fewer consequences than a dog would ever face. So when a cat does choose to stay close to one particular person, out of every option available to it, that choice is not fulfilling some ancient genetic obligation. There is no 10,000-year-old instinct quietly forcing the decision from behind the scenes. It is, in the most literal biological sense available to us, optional. Chosen, not required. It's worth sitting with just how different this timeline actually looks compared to the dog's. Genetic studies tracing the domestic cat's DNA back through thousands of years show something remarkable. The modern house cat is barely distinguishable, genetically, from the African wildcat that first wandered toward those ancient grain stores. A handful of genes changed, the ones tied to fear response, the ones tied to tolerance of human proximity. Almost nothing else. Compare that to the dog, whose genome has been reshaped almost beyond recognition from its wolf ancestor, sculpted deliberately across thousands of generations into dozens of specialized breeds built for entirely different jobs. Cats, by contrast, still carry the instincts of a solitary hunter that never needed a pack, never needed a leader, and never evolved to read human hierarchy the way dogs did. Every bond a modern cat forms is, in a sense, being built almost from scratch, negotiated individually, animal by animal, person by person, rather than inherited wholesale from 10,000 years of selective breeding. Which finally raises the real question buried underneath all of this. If nothing is forcing the bond to exist, what actually decides who gets chosen out of everyone in the room? In 2019, a team of researchers at Oregon State University ran an experiment that deliberately mirrored one of the most influential studies in all of developmental psychology. The strange situation test, originally designed decades earlier to measure attachment between human infants and their primary caregivers. The setup itself was simple, almost deceptively so. The owner then leaves briefly, leaving the cat alone in an unknown space. A cat and its owner sit together in an unfamiliar room for a few minutes. After a short interval, the owner returns. What researchers actually measured wasn't whether the cat missed its owner during the separation. Almost every cat in the study showed some visible sign of stress while left alone, which itself already contradicted the old assumption of total indifference. What mattered far more, scientifically, was what happened in the moments immediately after the person came back into the room. The majority of cats in the study, just over 60%, displayed what psychologists call secure attachment. They approached their person almost immediately, made physical contact, and then visibly calmed down before resuming normal exploratory behavior around the room, using the human, quite literally, as what's known as a secure base. Comfort came from the person specifically, and once that comfort was received, the cat felt safe enough to go back to investigating its surroundings. The remaining cats showed patterns closer to insecure attachment. Some clung to their owner and struggled to settle back down at all, while others avoided contact altogether, despite showing clear physiological signs of stress just moments earlier. The overall pattern was remarkably close to what's consistently found in studies of human infants, facing the same kind of separation and reunion, which meant something significant. Cats weren't simply tolerating the humans they lived with out of convenience. They were forming genuine, measurable attachment bonds, with real individual variation, in largely the same structural way people do. There's a second layer to this that researchers only uncovered later, and it has less to do with any single cat's personality, and more to do with timing. Kittens go through what's known as a critical socialization window, roughly between 2 and 7 weeks of age, during which their capacity to bond comfortably with humans is largely set for life. A kitten handled gently and frequently during that narrow stretch tends to grow into an born in the wild or separated from human contact too early. Adult cat capable of forming secure, easy attachments. A kitten that misses that window entirely often struggles to bond as deeply, no matter how much affection it receives later on. It isn't a matter of trying harder as an adult. The door was only ever open for a few weeks, and it closes on its own schedule, with or without anyone's permission, which explains why two cats raised in nearly identical households can end up with such different capacities for closeness. The variable was never really about which person in the house deserved the bond the most. Sometimes it was already decided before the cat ever set foot in that living room at all. But even this landmark study didn't fully answer the original question of who gets picked when a cat has more than one person to choose from. So later research pushed further into that specific gap and found that the deciding factor wasn't the amount of affection offered to the cat, but the manner in which it was offered. Across multiple follow-up studies, cats consistently formed stronger bonds with the person who let the cat initiate physical contact, rather than the person who tried hardest to get it. Not the person who scooped them up the moment they walked in the door. The one who simply offered an open hand low to the ground, and then waited. Not the person who followed them from room to room hoping for attention, without pressing further. It was measuring something closer to trust, specifically. In other words, the cat was never really measuring how badly someone wanted closeness with it, who respected the distance it needed to keep, right up until the exact moment it decided, entirely on its own, to close that distance itself, which quietly explains the entire scene from the beginning of this video. The two people working hardest most visibly for the cat's attention were, without realizing it, working directly against the very thing that actually builds trust with an animal like this. But trust, once it starts forming, doesn't stay invisible for long. It shows up in a handful of very specific behaviors, ones most cat owners see every single day without ever knowing what they're actually witnessing. Take the slow blink. Anyone who lives with a cat has seen it. The cat looks at you, closes its eyes slowly, deliberately, and opens them again. It looks almost sleepy, almost accidental. It is neither. In the wild, a predator never closes its eyes voluntarily near something it doesn't trust completely. Vision is survival. Closing your eyes near a potential threat is, evolutionarily speaking, an enormous risk. So when a cat does it deliberately, in your direction, it is quite literally demonstrating that it does not consider you a threat worth watching. Researchers have since confirmed this experimentally. Cats slow blink more frequently at the specific humans they're most bonded to, and will often blink back if a person mirrors the gesture toward them. Then there's kneading, that rhythmic pressing of paws against a blanket, a lap, sometimes a person's stomach. It traces back to kittenhood, to the motion used against a mother's body to stimulate milk. Most cats never fully outgrow it. When an adult cat kneads against a specific person, it is, in a very real sense, briefly returning to the one relationship in its life defined by total, unguarded dependence, and choosing to extend a fragment of that same vulnerability to someone new. And then there's the belly. A cat exposing its stomach is not, in most cases, an invitation to touch it. It's something closer to an announcement. The stomach is the one part of a cat's body with no real natural defense. The place a predator would strike first in the wild. A cat that rolls onto its back near a specific person, fully exposed, undefended, is making a statement that requires no interpretation at all. Near you, specifically, it does not feel the need to protect its most vulnerable point. There's a quieter signal too, one most people never notice at all. Head bunting, where a cat presses the top of its skull directly against a person's hand, leg, or face. Cats have scent glands concentrated around the head, and bunting is, at its core, a marking behavior. The same instinct wild cats use to mark territory and other cats within their social group as familiar, as safe, as belonging to the same shared space. A cat that headbutts a specific person is doing something closer to claiming than requesting. It is folding that person into its own private definition of home. Every one of these behaviors traces back to the same ancient calculation that first pulled a wildcat toward a grain store 10,000 years ago. Is this closer, safer than the alternative? And every time a cat performs one of them toward a specific person in a house full of options, it is quietly answering that question all over again in real time. Here is the part of this story that quietly reframes everything that came before it. We tend to assume, almost without question, that love and connection are earned primarily through effort. Feed someone, entertain them, give them your time and energy, and their affection should follow naturally, almost like a return on an investment. It's a framework we're taught from early childhood onward, in one form or another. Try harder, and you get more back in return. But a cat doesn't calculate connection that way at all. Because a cat was never shaped by evolution to need anyone's approval in order to survive. It carries no built-in obligation to reward effort simply because effort was made. So instead, it responds to something far simpler in concept and considerably harder for a person to fake convincingly. Safety, not physical safety alone, but something closer to emotional safety. The specific, felt sense that nothing is currently being demanded of you, and nothing will be. In the next moment either. The person a cat chooses to sleep beside isn't necessarily the one who tried the hardest to earn that spot. It's the one who allowed the cat to simply exist nearby without requiring anything back. In return, no performance expected, no attention demanded on command, just quiet presence offered without any attached conditions. And this is where the cat, entirely without meaning to, ends up telling us something true about every kind of bond people form with each other. Romantic relationships, family relationships, even long friendships. The connections that tend to feel most secure over time are rarely the ones built on the most visible effort. More often, they're the ones where a person is finally allowed to stop performing altogether and simply be present and still be chosen anyway. That is a strange kind of comfort to receive from an animal that, roughly 10,000 years ago, didn't need a single one of us to survive at all. It's worth noticing, too, that this pattern doesn't stay fixed forever. Cats have been observed shifting their primary attachment to a different person entirely. Sometimes after months, sometimes after years. Usually following a change in who offers that same quiet, undemanding presence most consistently. A new partner moves in and slowly earns the spot, and the cat notices before anyone else in the house does. A child grows old enough to stop grabbing and start waiting. The bond was never assigned permanently to begin with. It's continuously re-earned, quietly, through the same handful of signals, over and over, for as long as the relationship lasts. Which means the 4 people in that house were never actually competing for a fixed prize that only one of them could win once. They were each, every single day, being silently evaluated all over again. And the only one who kept passing that evaluation was the one who had, without ever articulating it consciously, stopped trying to win in the first place. So picture that same house again, one more time. 4 people living under one roof. 3 of them pouring visible effort into being loved back by the same small animal. One of them simply existing quietly in the room, asking for nothing in particular from her. The cat's choice, in the end, was never really the mystery it first appeared to be. Once you understand what it was actually measuring the entire time. It wasn't measuring devotion or effort or who tried hardest to win her over. It was measuring peace. 10,000 years ago, a wild animal walked toward the edge of a human settlement. Not because survival forced it to, but because something about that particular place felt marginally safer than every alternative available to it at the time. In its own quiet, instinctive way, it has been making that exact same calculation ever since, person by person, room by room, generation after generation. Maybe that's the real reason this particular story tends to resonate so widely. Far beyond anyone who simply happens to own a cat. Not because it explains cats especially well, though it does that too, but because somewhere underneath all of our own noise and effort and constant trying to be chosen by the people around us, we're still quietly asking the exact same question that animal first asked beside the fire. 10,000 years ago, where exactly do I feel safe enough to stay?